Okay, I think we're recording. Welcome everyone to the Be Better Club. And today's topic is writ large about intellectual property. And I don't know how many among you got a chance to listen to the podcast, but to give a little bit of background to our discussion, and then I'll open it up so we can kind of riff off of it. The issue of intellectual property is complex, dear to many of our hearts, and maybe less dear to some. But it really is an interesting history. It's enshrined in a sense in our Constitution. We have a constitutional right to patent and own intellectual property, but the notion of intellectual property, I think, has grown to such a large scope, especially maybe after World War II, as innovation really exploded and as commerce fueled growth, technology fueled growth, and as the world became more connected and globalized, right? Kind of a bad word sometimes these days. But of course, growth globally has not been uniform. Third world countries struggle to catch up in terms of standard of living, and that's driven often by technology. Such an interesting concept out there, sometimes called the resource curse. Countries that may be rich in resources often don't necessarily share the wealth and benefit as much because they can export a raw material, but then importing finished goods with added value can actually cost more. And so that and the need to sustain people is driven so much, especially in the third world, the race to catch up technologically with the first world. But who owns the intellectual property? Who owns the know-how? A lot of it is fundamentally about trade secrets or capabilities that reside within a trained population. And so that sets the stage then for above board and below board competition. Now, fast forward to where we stand in 2020, 2021, where there's competition, but also challenge with trading partners, especially China. And a lot of this has come to a head, especially for university environments and for companies where corporate espionage is very important, but also theft of intellectual property, even from within university environments, has become the norm. And this really hit the papers with a couple of different events. One, which comes close to my discipline of chemistry, was when Charles Lieber, a very famous chemist at Harvard, was arrested by the FBI. And my understanding of that situation is that he had been involved with China's 1,000 Talents program. I believe he had a lab in China that was funded, which he was partly running. And he also had funds that were coming into the US to help sustain his operations in the US. And the FBI investigated, but the big problem was that he denied that he was receiving support from foreign entities. And so an issue of full disclosure. In the end, he was arrested by the FBI. He was not defended by Harvard. So now there's a conflict between the investigator, the institution, and the feds. I think that event really brought the issue of universities, conflict of interest, engagement with foreign nationals to a head. And then here in Florida, as some of you might know, two House bills came forward, 7017, which concerned foreign influence, is designed ostensibly to prevent the kinds of things here in Florida that happened with regard to Charles Lieber. And also Bill 1523, which concerns corporate espionage. The flow down from these kinds of things is so complex, right? We know that. Some say if you don't like rules, just break one and there'll be sure to be another, right? The fallout from the Charles Lieber event and the Florida bills here has really complicated the landscape at our university and others in Florida, because now there's restrictions on hiring workers from foreign countries. There's now, we're tasked or required to do background checks on employees, especially from China and Iran. And to some extent that had always been there with federal employment rules, but now Florida has its own. university environments have to scramble to figure out how to meet the requirements of the law, it just gets very, very complicated, right? If you listen to the podcast, what you heard there is a story of agricultural technology espionage, where seemingly unwittingly, this gentleman, Kevin Montgomery, who was a farmer, became involved with a guy named Robert Moe, I believe, who was with a DBM or DMB, I think is the company, which ostensibly was looking to have him consult on seed growing, but as it turned out was probably trying to steal seed technology. So Monsanto and others grow proprietary gene lines of crops, and you can plant those through purchase. It's a contractual obligation. You can't reuse the seeds. You have to repurchase the seeds from DuPont. That connects to broader issues, who funds that technology, who really owns it. So that's the stage, and it's a big sweeping stage, isn't it? And as always, we enjoyed hearing your comments on what the ethical issues are. These, we all come from different backgrounds, right? There's scientists among us, folks in the humanities, folks in philosophy, and so there's our stage. Who wants to strut upon it first and offer some insights or thoughts, either from the podcast or that history of events that I laid out? I'll open it up. Just take yourself off of mute and jump out there. Lakeland, you always have a thought. I'm going to make you go first.
Beautiful. Well, I think one of the first things that I would have a question about, because I see in the chat, Sarah had mentioned that copyright and IP laws vary internationally, and I'm not as familiar with all of that. So I was wondering if somebody could give a rundown of maybe some of the differences between them, because that to me is always super interesting, or that to me is always a topic area that I don't think is often covered when we can, or at least in my experience and in my realm, when we think about ethics and ethical situations, taking it internationally or taking it to and considering other perspectives on things as far as non-Western ideas is not super prevalent, right? So I don't know. That would be my initial kind of question, I think, for everyone else, because I'm not well versed in that.
So like all good things, that one's complex, but Sarah, as you threw it out, you want to take first crack, and then Svetlana can also maybe comment.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask Svetlana's opinion as well. So for those who don't know me, my name is Sarah Norris, and I'm the Scholarly Communication Librarian here at UCF. So I was really interested in today's session because sort of my background is copyright, and Svetlana, of course, has different expertise as well in terms of IP. And so some of the things that I think, we talk about this a bit in some of the workshops that I host for graduate students and postdocs on copyright and author rights, is some of these sort of non-Western, as you said, Lakeland, sort of international copyright law. So it does vary, as Svetlana will also probably say, sound like a lawyer, because I will say it depends. Everything is, of course, contextual and will depend on the country of origin. But I think some of the high level things, the terms may be different. The terms of duration for copyright protection may be different. What things are protected may be different. And then also some of the things that we are accustomed to here in the United States, like fair use. So the ability to use copyrighted content in limited ways is not necessarily reflected in other countries. Other countries may have something called fair dealing, which is similar, but not quite the same, and maybe a bit more restrictive. So there are definitely some challenges vis-a-vis that. Svetlana, anything you want to chime in that I missed from sort of a high level?
No, you're absolutely right, and and I'm not an expert on all the different kind of international nuances, and but you're right. As far as copyright, it's the duration of the protection. And really the assumption, who really owns it. Is it could it be the employer directly versus the person who really creates it? So there's a lot of layers to copyright, and patents is a whole other kind of different area as well. And in most of the countries, if an invention is published, there are no more rights that can be secured. It's considered to be in the public domain. Whereas in the US, we still have a year from the date of publication where the inventor can, or the employer of the inventor, can go ahead and seek patent protection. So there are like just so many differences. For example, in the US, if there are joint inventors, let's say, then each one has an undivided share of the entire invention. So, let's say somebody contributed to in a really big way to something, and then somebody else had a much smaller contribution. It doesn't get divided by their relative contribution. If they're considered to be inventors and they contributed to the conception of the invention, then each gets a full use of the entire invention, and they don't have to account to each other. So each one can license it and or sell it because there's more than one. In this example two, it would have to be non-exclusive. So let's say whatever idea I had with my co-inventor, I can license it to Siemens, but it would be non-exclusive because the other co-inventor can go ahead and license it to Lockheed or whatever. And so the way to really generate value, and we're now kind of going somewhere else, but for us to work together, because together, if I have an agreement with my co-inventor, we can license it to one company and give exclusivity to that company, and that creates more value to the recipient versus Siemens and Lockheed having the same technology. It's less because they're competitors, it's less interesting to them. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of nuances. And one kind of and Sarah, you probably know this better than I do, the whole story about what is the copyright in the US and why it is that. Do you want to go into, because it's just so kind of random and it's interesting. So there's this law and there's this duration of copyright, but how did it get there? So I don't know if you want to jump in and tell us.
Yeah, that's a good. So in terms of contemporary copyright, can anybody guess why they think the terms and duration of copyright exist where it is right now, which is currently life of the author plus 70 years if you're an individual, or 120 years after date of creation if you are a corporate entity like Disney? Wink, wink.
I imagine for the individual, obviously the life of the individual, just so they can profit off their invention. But furthermore, the 70 years, I imagine, is so that their family and their children can also profit off their invention.
Yeah, that's a great piece of why it might exist. So for those, I saw a few chuckles on the video here. I mentioned Disney. To Svetlana's point, Disney is one of the companies that really lobbied, especially in the early 90s. We have something that is often referred to as either the Mickey Mouse Act or the Sonny Bono Act. It's from 1992, in which the terms of copyright were extended and will perhaps likely continue to extend, because if you are not aware, Mickey Mouse, specifically the version from Steamboat Willie, is up for entering the public domain in a couple of years. And so I would not be surprised if we see those terms extended. So a lot of what happens in the United States in particular is a lot of corporate entities and lobbying also impact the ways in which our copyright laws have continued to grow and evolve, and in many ways really lengthen. And Austin put in a note about Marvel. Yes, that's a big one. There's a big conversation right now about Marvel, and the family is suing for some character rights. I just read about that.
So how does that work? I don't know if anyone knows. If a company like Disney, which clearly has a lot of clout, wants to extend, the Steamboat Mickey copyright, if the law says it's about to expire, I would think, oh, it's going to expire. Or is there a formal vehicle which they can apply for in order for it to be extended? Or are we talking about modifying the laws? And if it's the latter, is there an accessibility issue? Can anyone do that, or only Disney? Maybe Svetlana.
Take a crack at that, Svetlana.
Yeah, I don't know for sure, because I don't remember how how Disney got it to be extended, but it's a lot of lobbying, because it's going to have to go through Congress. So can anybody do it? Well, with deep pockets, to create the momentum and the lobbying force behind it, and to put it out there, and they they can make the argument that it benefits the creators and, like we were saying, the families. So it's, I guess, it depends what the sort of the opposition is, and how much support that they can mount. But definitely it would have to be a bill that's introduced. And I guess, I don't know, Sarah, do you know any more about the Disney, specifically about the Disney situation?
Yeah, I know that there is some lobbying happening right now. And certainly this is a great conversation for this, sort of in tandem with this idea of IP theft, entities being very protective of their works, but also this idea of ethical behavior too, as well, right? And this idea of inequities, because they do have deep pockets and they have a lot of foundation and lobbying, they're spending a lot of time and money to be protective of their rights. I will suspect we may see some law go into, at least be reviewed, but I haven't seen anything specifically happening now, just more so that I've heard on the back end. There is definitely conversations happening vis-a-vis copyright extension. There's also some conversations about possibly grandfathering in is not the correct term, but sort of making some sort of exception or almost moving Mickey Mouse and sort of some of their intellectual property into other areas of intellectual property, not just copyright, but other areas of IP, especially because Mickey Mouse is so well associated with Disney, but also has protections under trademarks and logos too, which is another piece of copyright law that is related, but not necessarily the same thing. So there's a lot of moving pieces and nuances, as Svetlana said, that are definitely coming to the fore.
I think that's an interesting one, just because, good discussions about ethics are often about dilemmas. So if you lived in Colorado and had stock in, say, Warner Brothers, maybe you'd be rooting for the mouse to transfer to the public domain. But many of us here are actually in Florida, and to some extent, if you believe in the trickle-down idea, we could be beneficiaries of Disney maintaining that property, right? I mean, we depend quite a bit on our tourism industry, and Disney benefits our community tremendously. So I think it's interesting to sit in this situation where, depending upon your perceptions, you might say, oh, that's not fair, the rule is the rule. And on the other hand, you might say, well, I hope we can keep a good thing going here that clearly benefits our economy. Might not be a conundrum for such, but I think we have to be cognizant of, economic drivers, and how the pure application of a law sometimes results in some losers if you're not paying attention to the economic circumstances that surround them.
Well, and it favors the little guy, right? So just Disney is the one pushing it, but it'll impact all artists, right? And so to have that longer protection, it kind of sounds good to everyone. It's hard to argue against it. Unless, like I said, you have stock in Warner Brothers, or you've got your eye on some Marvel characters that you're hoping will loosen up and you can grab the images. But but still, as an artist, that you want your product to be protected. So it's really hard to kind of go against Disney and the momentum to extend the protection to make it longer, because it does tend to benefit the artist in general. One thing, though, I guess I just wanted to mention, because it's kind of an interesting fact about copyright. So with copyright, there's a presumption that the owner of it is the person who actually creates it. I know it sounds obvious, but in everyday lives, it could impact kind of the way you think about it, and what rights do you really have. So if you hire somebody, even like with photographers, right? If you go and you have family photos, they give you basically the photographer owns those photos, and they give you a limited license to use them. And so if there's something that you want to have absolute rights to, you're gonna have to make sure you read the fine print and you negotiate it. Like wedding photographers or whatever, they retain certain rights. They can keep that image on their website to advertise their skills or their portfolio. So if there's something that just because you pay for something and you get that product, doesn't mean you receive the entire right in that product. So just in your everyday sort of live photographs, or if you hire somebody to create a website for you, let's say you start a company and you have somebody create a website, that person, the creator, is still going to own it unless you contractually transfer the rights. So just because you paid them does not mean, and they delivered a copy, to you to put on your server or whatever, does not mean that they didn't retain rights. So you always want to negotiate in a written contract the flow of rights when you're dealing with copyrights. Well, with everything, but copyrights, the presumption sits that it is owned by the creator. So you actively have to have those terms and the rights flow to you. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I think one of the things too, that bringing it back to academia and how we approach that even from scholarly research, you may not actually be the copyright holder of your academic research once you publish it. You may sign an agreement with a publisher, which you actually are the author of record, but you transfer that copyright to the publisher. Certainly there are other things, even as an academic institution, this kind of plays back to the broader themes of today. With the collective bargaining agreement, if you're a faculty member, there are pieces about your research and ownership, things that may be owned by the institution. Certainly from Svetlana's perspective with OTT, inventions and works and other things related to patents and trademarks may also have some institutional ownership in there as well.
You know, the web has changed that in a couple of ways, and I'll throw two out there, and you can rebut as appropriate. But on the academic side, my understanding, I hope this is correct, is that things that we put onto, say, web courses as a teaching vehicle, those are owned by the university. We retain rights to our creations, but the content that's distributed through web courses, I believe, is owned by the university. So that's one thing, correct me later if I'm wrong, but the presence of the web as a means for distributing information has really pushed that boundary of, you know, who owns it and what constitutes creative embellishment and extension of works. So Allison may recall, but I think we had a discussion like this a couple months back, maybe, where we were discussing specifically how one artist can be inspired by another work and add to it. We see that in the music industry with sampling quite a bit. And some had made the arguments, you know, once it goes out onto the web, it's kind of a free-for-all there, that, you know, you can blog and post, and yes, you created it, but that doesn't entitle you to some ownership of that. Others can take it and use it and create a meme or whatever. So it seems to me like there's a tension in this this principle of copyright and ownership that's being pushed or morphed depending by electronic means, by the web or web delivery. And the first case, if I'm right, about scholarship, it's kind of gone the other direction. No, once you put it there, you lose it and we own it. In the case of memes and blogs and that sort of stuff, once you put it there, nobody owns it. Feel free to jump in on that.
So this isn't, it depends, right? So Svetlana will say the same thing. So one of the things that I always talk about, especially when we're thinking about online, there's a couple of things. Publicly accessible does not mean that it's copyright free. So assume anything that you find online is protected by copyright unless you can prove otherwise. We want to be good, you know, responsible stewards of copyrighted content, both as users as creators. So I think that's a really important thing to remember. There are things within US copyright law that do allow us to do things using fair use with transformative works. That may be taking a photo from something we find online and using it in a presentation for a lecture that we're teaching, but that may not apply in every single situation. So you have to assess that on a case-by-case basis. And then when we're thinking about online teaching, the ways in which copyright laws exist for teaching, especially in face-to-face, we have things like the face-to-face teaching exception, which allow us to show films or things like that in person. And yet, because of this complexity of the online environment, which you mentioned, Stephen, is different. And so there's a inherent distribution aspect that happens. And so we have to be very conscious and intentional when we're looking at resources that we share in our web courses, not downloading a video we get from YouTube or linking out to something that may be, you know, an illegal copy of a film on YouTube, or making sure, again, we're conscious and intentional and assessing everything that we're utilizing and making sure that we're, you know, acting within not only the spirit of the law, but the actual law when we're thinking about copyright is really important.
Let's come back. Oh, go ahead, Svetlana. Oh,
sorry. I was just going to say that the copyright regulation was revised recently. I think I'm looking at the version that was, it's dated. So this is well, the collective bargaining agreement was revised. And so the copyright regulation was revised in December 2020. And so it's a little bit different, Dr. Kubler, than you said. The material that's developed for courses is owned by the creator, and university has a license to it. It used to be fuzzier. It's a little more clear. And that was very much bargained, in the collective bargaining sessions. And so basically university doesn't take ownership in the content. And then there's different, it depends, and there's different cases about how much university support is used and, all of that kind of stuff. But in a very general sense, it is owned by the faculty member, by the creator, and with the license to the university, and the university has the right to continue to use it for, to teach courses or have somebody else teach the course. And that's because we've had issues where the faculty member leaves 2 weeks before the course starts, and we need to be able to use the material to be able to offer it to the students and to have that continuity. So this was like very much of a compromise, but it's not owned by the university, it's owned by the creators with the rights to use by the university.
And that's with regard to online materials distributed through web courses.
Yeah, they call them instructional materials for online courses. Yes, those are the defined terms.
Great, thank you. So let's come back to the podcast and the story of this farmer and the involvement with China. What are some thoughts that maybe arose in your minds as you heard that story or heard my rehash of it?
So, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Allison.
So, for me, I think this brings up where you were bringing up technology in academic distribution. This brought up the move towards globalization too, and thinking, well, I'm collaborating with somebody. I want a job with somebody. This guy, has a pretty epic background in agricultural breeding, or not breeding, but like growing corn, basically. And so I was as shocked in the story as he was when the FBI agents show up at his farm out in the middle of nowhere, Illinois. And who'd have thought somebody who had that background would end up becoming an FBI secret agent? I don't know. So it brought in this idea of we can do our best to be intentional about the laws that apply to us, but then we're inevitably going to be surprised by other things. And in this example, he wasn't doing anything unethical. I think it's called seed spy. He was ending up having to spy on somebody else who was doing something unethical. But it's tough to tell, because if it was unethical for them, it was illegal internationally, but it was an interesting story that I would never have thought would come out of it. And I think my biggest surprise that the guy in the podcast continues to consult internationally on seed growing. And I was
Yeah, it is a complicated story, and I wasn't even clear in the way the story was rendered in what we might identify as
considered legal, but then
yeah, we lost you about 30 seconds ago, Allison, but we got a lot of it, and I was trying to, as you were fading in and out, I was trying to pick up on it. I had trouble identifying what some of the value conflicts were there. I mean, here's this guy engaged in his enterprise, he's sharing his knowledge, and it's okay, he goes off to China, maybe, perfectly innocently, not realizing maybe he is engaged in some form of espionage unwittingly. I was aware, as I was reading it, of some of the challenges and conflicts that arise even domestically between farmers and Monsanto and other holders of patents, because you can get seed drift, cross-pollination across plots of land, and then if they regrow that, then they're in violation. So I kind of thought that's where it was going. but I guess there's several values, embodied in the law or not, that come into conflict there, because there's the issue of technology, maybe not so much with agriculture, but security, international issues. I even saw it as kind of a free enterprise issue, even a states' right issue. Individual states will negotiate and work to develop commerce with other countries. And there's a big UK presence right here in Florida. That's what consulates do, and so a state may want to try to engage in export technology, but could run afoul of the feds. And I saw lots of potential space for conflict there. I think it'd be obvious, like Austin and Austin Brigham and Horvath, they're former students of mine. They're in the optics industry, right? So you guys are fully aware of where some of your technology might be used, right, by state actors in nefarious ways. And you've heard about export restrictions, but this person growing corn, not necessarily. And so I didn't know if others picked up and identified on value conflicts, that raised red flags for them, where maybe the law wasn't perfectly fair or something.
Yeah, so kind of going off what I mentioned in chat about how it seems like we're not making asking a lot of ought questions, a lot of prescriptive statements in this conversation, as opposed to usual. With someone like that, it almost seems like it'd be easy, depending on your industry and your background, to almost inadvertently commit either corporate espionage or some form of like copyright infringement. And I guess like in the case, like in the podcast, or just in similar cases in general, like who do you think the onus ought be on, both legally and ethically, to like be stalwart against that,
Well, do you want to answer your own question? You'd said we should get to more of the ought. So what did you think of that story?
I mean, it seems like he was an individual who just was kind of wanted to do the right thing at each step, but still wanted to like find a way to profit off his years of knowledge and schooling. I thought it was very interesting that at the end he still went into working for Chinese firms regardless. I think it seems like he had very good intentions, given that he didn't let the potential legal trouble scare him off from another one. And I'm sure he was a lot more alert about it in the future. But someone who hasn't run into this, let's say that the FBI, or I forget which federal agency it was in the story, hadn't caught wind and approached him, and he had gotten in deeper unintentionally, like what happens to that individual, and what do you think ought to happen to that individual? I'm sure it'll be on a case-by-case basis, but like seems like he was not that far from a potential point of no return, where he had maybe done something unintentionally that he couldn't get out of so easily legally. So maybe I'm sure there are people in here that know a little bit more about similar cases where maybe there was inadvertent corporate espionage committed. And I'm kind of curious what happens there, with the legal system.
Well, I mean, I would say that the companies go after you. It's such a different culture now. I would just say a little anecdote that kind of maybe just sheds a little more light to it. So my background is in life sciences, and it's different because it's just like we're talking about crops here. So it's different than you all in optics, in that these things can propagate, and so it's so much easier to just take a little bit, give it to somebody, make a little on the side. It'll regenerate. It'll make itself. Viruses, bacteria, plants, seeds. So it opens up it to a kind of a different way of stealing, propagating. So I'll just tell you a quick story. So when I was in graduate school, there was this fabulous story that everybody would tell about this is early molecular biology, and somebody made this bacterial DNA out of a bacterial virus, a virus that infects bacteria. And it was this huge advancement, and everybody wanted some, and this laboratory didn't like to share. And so this one graduate student, I think she was at Stanford at the time, whatever, wrote a letter to this laboratory asking if she could have a little bit of that, they're called a bacteriophage, so a virus that infects bacteria. So she asked for a little bit of this, it was called lambda-phage DNA. And she received a very polite letter that said, nope, sorry, we don't feel like sharing it just yet. We want to study it some more and whatever. And so she thought, this letter might have been, written inside of their laboratory. They touched it with their fingers or whatever, gloves or whatever. And maybe there's a little bit of this bacterial viral DNA on the envelope. And she took this envelope, tore it in little pieces, soaked it in water. And sure enough, she got the little viral bacteriophage, whatever, lambda-phage DNA. And this was a great story. So there she was, and she studied it, and she was just this little hero, and everybody talked about it and liked to tell this story. Well, and back then it was this entertaining story, and okay, fine, and we know who she is and whatever. It was just like she was proud of it, and it was this wonderful example of ingenuity. Well, how would that look today, right? Not so great, right? So our tolerance has changed. Our views on things have changed. Today, this would be theft, and she would have a whole bunch of people coming after her, and she would be discredited, and her publications would be withdrawn and all kinds of stuff because she didn't have the right to use that DNA. So our views on things evolve. I know that's I took us a little bit sideways, but it goes to this farmer as well. And it depends, when we look at that situation and in intent and the sort of the technology in the life sciences, technology lends itself to be handed over. And so the responsibility is with the user. And nowadays, we work in technology transfer, we work with scientists who they buy something, they'll buy a piece of DNA and they'll reconfigure it and they'll publish on it. And then somebody writes to them, say, hey, we read about this great DNA molecule that you made, and could we please have it? It'll make it a lot easier, instead of somebody buying it and making it themselves. That takes a lot of time. Could we have your version? So they'll come to us and go, hey, can I send it to so-and-so in Louisville or whatever? And we have to go back and we have to look at the terms and conditions from the purchase and to see, are they allowed to do it? And more often than not, they're not. And we have to go to the company and ask them, because now we have a combination. We have our own thing that we made, but it was based on their molecule. So it's so complicated. When somebody comes to us and goes, can I just send this over there? Why is it taking you so long? Svetlana, why has it been months? Well, that's because I'm tracing back every little piece of DNA that they've put in there to make sure we have permissions, because that's the world we live in now, and we have to be responsible. So is it easy for me to say, yeah, sure, send it to Louisville, it's all science, it's just research? Sure, that would be nice, but we can't do that. And I will just say one other thing. I'm just kind of throwing little nuggets out there. A lot of times in science and in research, people have this impression that you can do research, you just can't sell it, but you're allowed to do research. So you can just take somebody's ideas, you can take somebody's technology, and you can just use it as long as you're just doing research and you're not selling it. That is not true. There is no research exemption in patent law. So I'm just letting you kind of know, no such thing. You cannot use it if you're doing quietly in your lab, in your garage, wherever it is that you're using technology. If it's owned by somebody else, you do not have the right to use it without a license from them. And there's no such thing as a research exemption. All right, I'll stop there.
Any follow-up to that?
I just have a kind of question out of curiosity in the story about the, I think it was another university, you said, asking to buy this DNA after manipulation. So you mentioned that there was some of your own intellectual property along, local to UCF intellectual property mixed with this company's. Is in a case like that, is there like a certain amount of manipulation or change that could be done to where it kind of like a ship of Theseus type thing? If it's been manipulated so many times versus the original, is it still the original, and do those rights still apply to it, those copyright?
Great question. And, in these agreements, we have a whole set of definitions on what is the original material, on modified derivative, modification, that like all these little very circular definitions and very hard to tell. Generally speaking, with things like, those kinds of things in life science, you really still have bits and pieces. And so that new thing that our researcher made by adding a gene, let's say, into they're called plasmids, into that other piece of DNA that the researcher bought from a company, you can still tell the pieces. And so the company still owns their DNA piece, and then we own, if that was ours or whatever, have rights to the piece that we inserted, and we need their permission to be able to transfer that. So we really do painstakingly trace back what are the different pieces. It does get really complicated. We were just kind of talking about DNA, then there's a lot of stuff with mice and breeding them, and then who owns what. But generally, you're still tracing it back to whatever your contribution was. You know, is it a mouse strain? Is it the DNA? And then you have to kind of trace it back and get the right permissions. It really does get very complicated, but you do try to have the sense or the boundaries of what you contributed versus what new you put in there and how the rights flow.
So when we launched into this topic, we talked about the corn farmer, and then Charles Lieber, and then Florida House bills, and how that's flowed down. I'm wondering, what thoughts are out there, especially as it connects to ethics. Certainly made life complicated, right, for people like our VP for Research, Liz Klonoff, and Svetlana.
One thing I'll say, this isn't, I guess it might spark some conversation about ethics. It's not really an ethics take, though, is I know that there are some grad programs at UCF that primarily get a lot of students from international, undergraduate programs, and that are, having some trouble with recruitment because the provisions that are specific to Florida in the Foreign Influence Bill, HB 7017, I think, are putting up a lot of red tape for the introduction of foreign students to domestic grad programs.
I wouldn't come here if I was an international individual. I mean, I wouldn't move to Florida now. But what clearer message can we give someone than, if you're going to apply here, tell us every place you've worked since you were age 18, every place you've gone to school since you were age 18, and we're going to verify all of that to make sure that you really did work as a barista at Starbucks, and that you weren't somehow stealing people's DNA off their coffee cups and making some kind of bioweapon. I mean, and then we're going to look and make sure that you have it. And it is just such an unfriendly message. I mean, there's no way around it. It's just a terrible communication.
Yeah, what's interesting to me is that it seems, I don't want to get too political here, but it seems relatively ineffective to do on just a state level. I mean, I know this is somehow how these things start, but you can still go to if you had malicious intent as a foreign actor, you could still go to a university at 49 other states to go to their grad programs, which makes us have to compete a lot harder for domestic students as well, given how much that slims our pool of international students from certain countries. Now, like I said, I don't want to talk too much just about the politics of this, but it seems like a weird choice to do at the state level to me.
So it's not even necessarily a political observation. Your observation is the potential for a chilling economic impact, right?
Yeah,
just not
exactly.
be prudent state economics. Liz, you had mentioned that it was a bad message, and I didn't know if you were thinking from the standpoint of privacy rights and disclosing all of this personal information, or were you thinking along other lines?
Well, that's one whole area where it's a bad message. The original bad message I was thinking was, if I were outside the United States and thinking about, wow, where do I want to go to school? I would think they certainly don't want me in Florida, because look at what they're making me go through. And I can go to South Carolina or Georgia and, drive to see Mickey Mouse, going back to Mickey Mouse. I can go back there, and I don't have to suffer the indignity of providing all of this stuff. That's what I mean by bad message. Just in a state that prides itself on its business friendly opportunities, this is neither business friendly nor collaborative.
Go ahead, Lakeland.
Well, sorry, on that point too, like if UCF, if UCF in the universities at UCF, and I know that this is not necessarily something that we can control when it's a state sort of like mandate or what have you, but when we're trying to say that we're like HSI, or we're, a lot of recruitment material that UCF sends out says things like, hey, we've got a very large minoritized population and things like that. And we kind of like talk that up, but where do those like minoritized people and like HSI certification oftentimes doesn't necessarily come from your domestic students. That sometimes comes from your international students. And so I kind of agree, like, I don't know, just when I heard that there was this hiring freeze also on people who are not domestic, I was a little upset by that. I'm not gonna lie, like I wasn't like a huge fan of that, and of course I don't have all the information for it, and again, like there's a difference between what UCF does because it's UCF, or because it's what's told to them to do by the state.
I can help you with that, Lakeland, because the hiring freeze came from me, and we had a bunch of people who were making offers to international individuals after July 1, despite the fact that we put out communication that said, until we finish our process, don't do it. And so the only way to get people to not, people can actually advertise and interview, you just can't make an offer, but no one seemed to understand that. That seemed to be too fine a shade of distinction. So it was just a lot easier to say hiring freeze and then let people call me and yell at me, and I can say, oh, go ahead, advertise, interview, whatever you want. We're just waiting till we get the procedure up. I anticipate the procedures are just about done, so pretty soon the freeze will go away. But the problem is we had a bunch of people who knew they shouldn't have made offers, but made offers that now we have like, okay, now we got to go back. And so, my biggest fear in all of this, in all honesty, my biggest fear is we will say, sure, come to someone, and then we will find out that according to the new Florida statute, you cannot be here. And I really do not want to be in the business of taking away someone's visa or firing someone or throwing them out of graduate school. So part of the goal of this was to just not put me in the position of saying, you're out of here. So,
absolutely.
And unfortunately, freeze was the only way to do it, because everyone understands a freeze. No one understands don't make an offer. So.
Thank you for that. Like I obviously, like I said, like I didn't have all of that, and that it makes a lot of sense. And it's unfortunate that you even were in that position to have to do that, right? And I think that that brings in sort of that ethical discussion too, when we're talking about earlier. I lost my train of thought, but it was anyway, I lost it. I was going down it, I had it, and then it just left. But thank you, Dr. Klana, for that. And I'm sorry that like you're even in a position, I apologize that you're even in a position where you have to do that. You know what I mean?
Well, maybe that's the ethical thing you were going to, which is what happens when the requirements of your job require that you do something that you find less than 100% tasteful.
Right.
And I think then what do you do? I think it's an interesting position for me to be in, frankly. Not an enviable one.
Not many are going to be in your position at that level, but I don't think it's that uncommon of a situation for people in companies to, to have to wrestle with I got to do it, but I maybe shouldn't do it, or it doesn't seem right to me. I mean, that's an overall challenge too, where you have individual values and individual ethics, and then you have organizational values, and they're not necessarily congruent. We only have about 8 minutes. I really hate to open this Pandora's box, but the other thing that's been looming in the back of my mind when we talk about technology and intellectual property is the timeliness of COVID. You know, a lot of money was put into research to make vaccines, mRNA technologies, to accelerate them and bring them out for emergency approval to combat COVID. And the discussion has started to surface, well, you know, what level of profitability is fair for companies like Pfizer and others that have made the vaccine, especially going forward if this becomes effectively a cash cow in the sense that we constantly need to have boosters, and yet so much public funding has gone into that, and there's a public imperative to have the vaccines available. So I didn't know, that's a big subject, right? But we've got a few minutes here. I didn't know if others were thinking about that issue as well. Maybe not.
It's a tough one. So Moderna, who kind of all of a sudden was, thrust kind of in the public eye, they've said it's taken them 10 years. This is not a new platform, because everybody was worried, this is new, it hasn't been experimented, 4 months, and there we are, being injected with this stuff. But they've spend millions and millions into the infrastructure, into creating that technology, and years and years of research. So, and it goes back to another comment that was just put in the chat about just the expense of drugs and all that. It's a tough one. Certainly if the companies can't make money, they will not innovate. So, in some ways it's easy when we're all healthy to sit here and say, oh, they're making so much profit, oh, this, that, and the other. And then when you need that special drug, and let's hope none of us do, for us or our families, but when you need that and you go in and you are the recipient of that innovation that changes your life and restores your health, you're very grateful to have that. And what is it worth, right? Do we want the companies to be able to innovate and to be able to put new medications out there? Of course. Are there ways in which we can make the technologies more accessible? I'm not going to have all the answers, and we don't, have a lot of time. But sure, and so there's got to be sort of some sort of middle ground where, and a lot of companies actually do have compassionate use programs or compassionate discounts. But generally, we look at it and we think that just the money is so huge, but it takes a lot of money to do the large, clinical studies, and to continue to put the products out there, and to continue to innovate, and to continue to collect data and optimize technologies. So granted, I'm wearing that technology transfer hat, and so so I do think that the companies need to be able to make the money so that they continue the research and continue to put new products into the pipeline.
I threw out into the chat a speaker series that's coming up. This is giving me my push and promotion for a new speaker series that we're running out of the UCF Center for Ethics. And the topic is, or the title is, Ethically Speaking. It's a series that's looking at moral issues of our times. And some of the things that we've talked about are actually going to be addressed by some of the speakers that are coming in. Our second speaker in the series is Brian Quinn, an assistant professor at University of Portland, and he's going to look at lessons learned from COVID. And I just wonder if this is going to be one of the major lessons learned, to try to understand or revisit the public-private partnerships that we thrive from, and yet to re-examine and try to understand, is there equity, is there sufficient equity, and how do we create flexible enough arrangements that in a situation like a pandemic, we generate the most public good without dampening the incentive for innovation, right? Even outside of the pandemic, the issue of innovation versus access to medical care has loomed large. And I think COVID has just amplified that and amplified the focus on it. Our first speaker in this series, however, is going to be Dr. Michael Levin from Tufts University. And it's also related because he's going to talk about the technology and the ethics of artificial life. We may have to have a whole nother Be Better Club meeting on this, maybe after the talk, and ask Svetlana, Liz, and all of you to come back and talk about it. I think I know, you can't patent necessarily a living thing, but you can patent a plant and you can patent some genetics. We've already had that discussion. Maybe a lot of that is going to be forced to change. We'll find out from our speaker, but he's going to show examples of where it's now, increasingly possible to create forms of life that don't fit within our current phylogenetic tree. If you'll give me the space, one of the things that he's done, which I heard about on NPR, so I thought, we got to get this guy to come talk to us here at UCF, found ways to take cells from the surface of a certain frog and coax them through chemical cocktails to form a structure where the little cilia cause them to swim around. These cilia would normally be on the surface of the frog, moving mucus and making a healthy frog, but he's managed to coax them into these things that he calls xenobots, right? Because they're not really living necessarily, or that's not clearly a living organism, and they're also a little bit like robots, hence the name xenobots. They do some really interesting collective behavior. Some sit around, some move, some come together and then seem to organize almost like ants in a colony. And so what he's saying is, do we need to really rethink what we call living, what we call machine, what we call in between, and then behind that is intellectual property. Some of us are a little long in the tooth and have gray hairs. These may not be the conundrums that we deal with, but for you younger people, I think these are things we're going to really have to think about. So I hope you'll participate in that speaker series and check out the link here. And we're just going to have to leave it there, aren't we? And unpack some more of these issues in our next Be Better Club meeting, right? Well, I thank you very much for all the contributions. I can talk forever, but I didn't have to do that much. You guys had a lot of really great contributions. I appreciate the newcomers and the old hats who are here at Be Better Club a lot. Spread the word. Hope we have more participation, and join us again next time. So I'll go ahead and stop our recording there. And thanks for joining us.